In the unforgiving wilderness of the Dakota Territory during the harsh winter of 1876, where survival meant everything in trust was a luxury few could afford, a story unfolded that would challenge everything the settlers believed about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. What started as a simple act of kindness would spiral into a web of deception, forbidden romance, and a secret so powerful it could destroy two worlds that were never meant to collide. Sarah Mackenzie had known rejection her entire 18 years of life. Born to parents who died when she was barely walking, she had been passed from one reluctant family to another throughout the small frontier town of Deadwood Gulch. The latest family, the stern and religious Hawthorns, had made it clear that her presence was nothing more than an obligation they barely tolerated. Mrs. Hawthorne's cold eyes followed Sarah's every move, counting each morsel of food she ate, each piece of firewood she used, each moment of warmth she sought by their hearth. But it was when Sarah accidentally broke Mrs. Hawthorne's prized china teapot while doing the endless chores that her fate was truly sealed. The woman's fury was swift and merciless. She was thrown out into the bitter December cold with nothing but the thin dress on her back and the devastating words that would echo in her mind forever. "You're nothing but a burden, girl. Find somewhere else to be someone else's problem." With nowhere to turn and the temperature dropping below freezing, Sarah stumbled through the snow-covered forest that bordered the town. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and her breath came in sharp, painful gasps that created small clouds in the frigid air. Just as hypothermia began to claim her consciousness, she spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be an abandoned trapper's cabin deep in the woods. Desperation drove her forward, and she pushed open the heavy wooden door, expecting to find nothing more than the remnants of a forgotten fire. Instead, she found herself face to face with the most striking man she had ever seen. His skin was bronzed by sun and wind, his long black hair braided with leather and beads, and his dark eyes held a depth of wisdom and pain that seemed to see straight through to her soul. This was Dakota, a Lakota warrior who had been separated from his tribe during a brutal cavalry attack 3 days prior. Here was the first twist that neither of them could have anticipated. Dakota wasn't just any warrior. He was the son of Chief Red Hawk, one of the most respected leaders among the Lakota people, and he carried with him information that could change the course of the ongoing war between his people and the white settlers. Hidden in his leather pouch was a detailed map showing the locations of cavalry supply routes, information he had gathered during months of careful observation. He had been making his way back to his tribe when the soldiers found his trail, forcing him to take refuge in this remote cabin that once belonged to a French trapper who had befriended his people years before. Neither Sarah nor Dakota spoke the other's language fluently, but necessity and compassion transcended words. She was dying from the cold, and despite every reason he had to distrust any white person, something in her eyes told him she was different. He wrapped her in warm furs, built up the fire, and shared his meager supplies of dried meat and herbs that would help restore her strength. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt what it meant to be cared for without condition or expectation of payment. As days turned into weeks, they developed their own way of communicating through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the few words each had picked up of the other's language. Sarah learned that Dakota meant friend to everyone in his language, though he confided that he hadn't felt like a friend to anyone since watching his younger sister die from the white man's diseases 2 winters ago. She shared her own story of abandonment and rejection, and in doing so, found someone who understood what it meant to carry pain that seemed too heavy for one person to bear. But their growing bond was complicated by the reality of the world outside that cabin. Search parties from Deadwood Gulch had been looking for Sarah, not out of concern for her welfare, but because the Hawthorns needed someone to blame for the missing food supplies and other small thefts that had been occurring around town. At the same time, both Lakota warriors and cavalry soldiers were scouring the area for Dakota, each group with their own deadly intentions. It was during the 3rd week of February, when the worst blizzard in decades trapped them completely in the cabin, that their relationship shifted from one of mere survival companionship to something deeper and more dangerous. The boundaries between two people from warring cultures began to dissolve in the intimate confines of their shared refuge. Sarah found herself drawn to Dakota's gentle strength and the way he treated her as if she had value beyond what she could do or provide. For Dakota, Sarah represented something he thought he had lost forever. The possibility of trust and tenderness in a world that had become defined by violence and loss. Their first kiss happened during a particularly fierce storm, when the wind howled so loudly around the cabin that they had to sit close together just to hear each other speak. What started as Sarah teaching Dakota English words for different parts of the cabin became an intense conversation about their dreams for a future that seemed impossible. When she told him that she had never imagined anyone could look at her the way he did, as if she were something precious rather than something to be tolerated, he cupped her face in his hands and told her in his broken English that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, inside and out. The physical relationship that developed between them was tender and passionate, but it was also shadowed by the knowledge that discovery would mean death for both of them. In the world outside that cabin, what they were doing was seen as the ultimate betrayal by both their peoples. Yet within those log walls, surrounded by firs and warmed by firelight, they created their own world where love was possible and the color of their skin didn't determine their worth. By early March, Sarah realized she was carrying Dakota's child. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. Joy because this baby represented the love she had found with the only person who had ever truly wanted her, and terror because she knew what this pregnancy meant in the context of the world they would have to face. Mixed-race children were outcasts in both cultures, unwanted and often abandoned or worse. But when she told Dakota about the pregnancy, his reaction surprised her completely. His eyes filled with tears of happiness, and he took her hands in his, speaking in rapid Lakota before switching to English. He told her that among his people, children were considered sacred gifts, regardless of the circumstances of their creation. He promised her that he would find a way to protect both her and their child, even if it meant giving up his own life to do so. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Sarah felt a spark of hope that maybe, somehow, they could find a way to make this impossible situation work. But their secret world was about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. Captain Morrison of the 7th Cavalry had been tracking Dakota for months, not just because he was a wanted warrior, but because Morrison knew about the information Dakota carried. Morrison had been selling cavalry supply information to hostile tribes in exchange for gold, and he needed to eliminate Dakota before the warrior could expose his treasonous activities. Morrison had finally traced Dakota to the general area of the cabin, and he was preparing to close in with a small group of soldiers who were loyal to him and unaware of his true motives. At the same time, a group of Lakota warriors led by Dakota's older brother, Chayton, had also picked up his trail. But Chayton wasn't coming as a rescue party. He had been convinced by some of the tribe's elders that Dakota had been captured and tortured into giving up tribal secrets, and that he needed to be killed to preserve the tribe's honor. The idea that his brother might be willingly cohabitating with a white woman was so unthinkable that it never occurred to any of them as a possibility. The two groups converged on the cabin on the same March morning, just as Sarah was experiencing the first strong movements of her growing baby. Dakota had gone out early to check the snares he had set for rabbits, leaving Sarah alone when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the melting snow. She looked out through a gap in the logs and saw soldiers surrounding the cabin from one direction and Lakota warriors approaching from another. Both groups were armed and clearly intended violence. Panic seized her as she realized that Dakota would be caught in the middle when he returned from checking his traps. She had to warn him, but stepping outside would expose her pregnancy and condemn them both immediately. In that moment of terror and impossible choices, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She set fire to the cabin's interior, creating a distraction that she hoped would give Dakota a chance to escape when he saw the smoke. But her plan backfired catastrophically. The approaching soldiers saw the smoke and assumed they were under attack, opening fire on the Lakota warriors, who returned fire thinking they had been ambushed. Dakota, hearing the gunshots and seeing the smoke, ran toward the cabin instead of away from it, desperate to save the woman he loved and the child she carried. Captain Morrison, recognizing Dakota among the chaos, broke away from the main conflict and pursued him toward the burning cabin. Sarah, now trapped inside with flames spreading rapidly around her, heard Morrison shouting Dakota's name and demanding that he surrender the information about cavalry positions. It was then that she understood the bigger picture. This wasn't just about forbidden love or cultural boundaries. Lakota had been carrying information that powerful men were willing to kill for, and their peaceful sanctuary had become the center of a deadly conspiracy. Through the smoke and flames, she saw Lakota burst through the door, his eyes wild with fear for her safety. He swept her up in his arms, covering her with a wet fur to protect her from the flames, and carried her toward the cabin's single window. But just as they reached it, a gunshot rang out behind them. Captain Morrison had followed them inside and put a bullet in Lakota's back. As Lakota collapsed, still trying to shield Sarah with his body, Morrison stepped closer, his gun trained on both of them. He told them he knew about the map Lakota carried, and that he couldn't allow either of them to live to expose what they had seen. But what Morrison didn't know was that Chayton had also entered the burning cabin, having seen his brother fall. The confrontation between Morrison and Chayton lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for Sarah to grab the leather pouch containing the map from Lakota's weakening grasp. As the two men struggled and the flames grew higher around them, she clutched the pouch against her pregnant belly and squeezed through the cabin's small back window. Behind her, she heard more gunshots, screams, and the roar of the fire consuming everything they had built together. Standing in the snow outside the burning cabin, watching the flames devour the only home she had ever known, Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could return to Deadwood Gulch and try to explain what had happened, but her pregnancy would be obvious soon, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. She could try to find Lakota's tribe, but as a white woman carrying what they would see as evidence of their warrior's betrayal, her reception would likely be equally deadly. Instead, she made a third choice that surprised even her. She would disappear entirely, creating a new identity and a new life far from both the white settlements and the tribal lands. She would find a place where her mixed-race child could grow up without bearing the burden of hatred from either culture. And she would guard the secrets contained in that leather pouch until she could find someone trustworthy enough to ensure they were used to bring justice rather than more violence. Her journey south took 3 weeks, during which she traded the valuable beads from Lakota's pouch for supplies and passage on wagons heading toward the Colorado mining camps. She told anyone who asked that she was a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, and that she was traveling to live with relatives. The story was believable enough, and her obvious pregnancy made most people sympathetic rather than suspicious. She settled in a small town called Silver Creek, where the population was transient enough that newcomers didn't attract much attention. Using skills she had learned from Lakota about herbal medicine and traditional healing, she established herself as a midwife and healer, serving the mining community and earning enough respect that no one questioned her past too closely. When her son was born in late August, she named him David, after the biblical king who had faced seemingly impossible odds and emerged victorious. The boy had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination, and as he grew, Sarah could see both cultures reflected in his features and temperament. She raised him with stories of both his heritages, teaching him to be proud of what he was rather than ashamed of what others might think he should be. But the secrets Sarah carried were too important to remain buried forever. The map she had taken from the burning cabin contained evidence not just of Captain Morrison's treachery, but of a larger conspiracy involving several high-ranking military officials who were profiting from the ongoing conflicts with native tribes. As David grew older and more curious about his father's people, Sarah realized she would eventually have to find a way to return this information to those who could use it to bring justice. The opportunity came when David was 15 years old. A federal investigator named Thomas Garrett arrived in Silver Creek, looking into reports of military corruption in the Lakota Territory. Sarah, now established as one of the most respected citizens in town, approached him carefully, testing his character and motivations before revealing what she knew. The information she provided led to one of the largest military corruption scandals of the era, resulting in court-martials, resignations, and significant changes in how the government managed relations with native tribes. Sarah testified anonymously, her identity protected by federal marshals who recognized the danger she faced from those who would want revenge. But perhaps more importantly, her testimony helped establish communication between reformers in the government and moderate leaders among various tribes, including some who had known Lakota and remembered him as a man of honor. Through these connections, Sarah was able to arrange for David to learn about his Lakota heritage from people who had known and respected his father. David grew up to become a translator and negotiator, working to bridge the cultural divide that had made his parents' love seem impossible. He married a woman who loved him for who he was rather than despite it, and they raised children who knew the full story of their grandparents' courage and sacrifice. As for Sarah, she lived to be 87 years old, long enough to see her great-grandchildren playing together without the hatred and fear that had defined her youth. In her final years, she would often sit on her porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red, and remember the man who had shown her what love could be when it transcended the boundaries society tried to impose. The burning cabin had taken everything from her that winter night in 1876, but it had also given her something equally powerful: the knowledge that love could survive even the most impossible circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to let hatred define what was possible. Her story became a whispered legend in Silver Creek, told by mothers to daughters as an example of how strength could be found in the most unlikely places, and how even the most rejected person could become the guardian of something precious enough to change the world. The years that followed David's marriage brought Sarah a peace she had never imagined possible during those desperate days in the burning cabin. But as she entered her 70s, Sarah began to feel the pull of unfinished business, a restless spirit that whispered to her in the quiet moments before dawn. There was something more she needed to do, something that would complete the circle of justice and healing that had begun with Dakota's sacrifice. It started with a letter that arrived on a crisp October morning in 1923. The envelope bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and inside was a request that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read it. The government was finally acknowledging the injustices committed against native tribes during the Indian Wars, and they were seeking testimony from anyone who had witnessed the corruption and violence that had characterized that era. They specifically mentioned the Morrison case, which had become a landmark in military justice reform, and they wanted to interview the anonymous witness whose testimony had exposed the conspiracy. Sarah sat in her kitchen for hours, staring at that letter and remembering the weight of Dakota's leather pouch in her hands as she fled the burning cabin 47 years earlier. She thought about the promise she had made to his dying eyes, that his sacrifice would mean something, that the truth would eventually prevail. Now, in the twilight of her life, she was being offered the chance to ensure that promise was fully kept. But revealing her identity after all these years would not be without consequences. There were still people alive who remembered the Morrison scandal, and some of them had never been brought to justice. Captain Morrison himself had died in prison, but his associates, the men who had profited from selling information to hostile tribes, had powerful connections and long memories. Coming forward now could put not just Sarah at risk, but David and his young family as well. Sarah spent weeks wrestling with the decision, walking the familiar streets of Silver Creek and seeking guidance from the mountains that had sheltered her for so many decades. It was during one of these walks that she encountered Mary Crow Feather, an elderly Lakota woman who had come to Silver Creek seeking treatment for her failing eyesight. Mary was the daughter of Chief Red Hawk, which made her Dakota's sister, though neither woman knew of their connection at first. Their meeting seemed coincidental, but Sarah had learned long ago that some coincidences were really the universe's way of arranging necessary encounters. Mary had heard stories from the old men of her tribe about Dakota's mysterious disappearance and the burning cabin where soldiers and warriors had died in a fierce battle. She had always wondered what really happened to her brother, whose body had never been found among the casualties. As Sarah listened to Mary speak about her lost brother, describing his gentleness and his gift for languages, his love of children and his dream of peace between peoples, she realized that the time for secrets had finally ended. That evening, in the privacy of her small parlor, Sarah told Mary the complete story of those winter months in the cabin, of the love that had grown between her and Dakota, and of the son who carried his blood and his spirit. Mary wept as she listened, not from shame or anger, but from joy at finally understanding what had happened to the brother she had mourned for nearly 50 years. She told Sarah that Dakota had always been different from other warriors, more interested in building bridges than burning them, and that his love for a white woman would not have surprised those who truly knew him. More importantly, she explained that in Lakota tradition, children were considered gifts from the Creator regardless of the circumstances of their birth, and that David had always been welcome among his father's people. Together, the two elderly women decided to travel to Washington, D.C. to give their testimony to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mary would speak for the Lakota perspective on the corruption and violence that had characterized the Indian Wars, while Sarah would provide the detailed evidence she had carried in secret for so many decades. But more than that, their joint testimony would demonstrate something unprecedented: a partnership between white and Native voices in the pursuit of truth and justice. The journey to the Capitol was arduous for both women, but they supported each other through the long train rides and the intimidating bureaucracy of the federal government. David accompanied them, serving as translator and protector, but also as living proof of the possibility for harmony between cultures that had been taught to see each other as enemies. Their testimony before the Congressional Committee investigating historical injustices lasted for 3 days. Sarah's detailed account of Captain Morrison's activities and the conspiracy to profit from tribal conflicts provided crucial missing pieces to investigations that had been stalled for decades. Mary's testimony about the impact of these betrayals on her people gave emotional weight to the legal evidence, helping lawmakers understand the human cost of the corruption they were examining. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Sarah presented the original map that she had taken from the burning cabin, the document that Lakota had died protecting. The leather pouch had been carefully preserved, and the beadwork that decorated it told its own story of a culture that valued beauty even in the midst of conflict. As Sarah placed it on the committee table, she explained that this was not just evidence of military corruption, but a symbol of the trust that Lakota had placed in her to ensure his death would serve a greater purpose. The committee's final report, published in 1924, included a full account of the Morrison conspiracy and its aftermath, but it also contained something unprecedented in government documents of that era: a formal acknowledgement that love and partnership between people of different races and cultures was not only possible, but could be a force for justice and healing. Sarah and Mary's testimony became part of the historical record, ensuring that future generations would understand that the path to reconciliation required not just political agreements, but personal connections that transcended the boundaries of prejudice. The publicity surrounding their testimony brought unexpected visitors to Silver Creek. Former soldiers who had served under honest officers came to thank Sarah for exposing the corruption that had endangered their lives. Native Americans from various tribes came to meet the white woman who had loved a Lakota warrior and raised his son with honor. Historians and writers came seeking to document a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about the Indian Wars. But the most meaningful visit came from Chayton's grandson, a young man named Joseph who had become a teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation. He brought with him a bundle wrapped in red cloth, which he presented to Sarah with great ceremony. Inside was a necklace that had belonged to Lakota, made of silver and turquoise, that had been recovered from the ruins of the burned cabin. Chayton had kept it for decades, hoping someday to return it to his brother's grave. But now he wanted Sarah to have it as recognition of the love she had shared with Lakota and the courage she had shown in honoring his memory. As Sarah held the necklace, feeling the weight of the silver against her palms, she experienced a sense of completion that she had been seeking for nearly 50 years. The circle of love and loss, sacrifice and redemption, had finally been closed. Lakota's death had not been meaningless, and their love had not been destroyed by the flames that consumed their cabin. Instead, it had been transformed into something larger and more enduring, a legacy of understanding and cooperation that would benefit generations to come. David, now approaching middle age himself, had watched his mother's journey toward this moment of peace with deep admiration. He had grown up knowing that he was the product of an impossible love, but also understanding that impossible things sometimes happened when people were brave enough to believe in them. As he watched Sarah embrace Joseph and accept the necklace that connected her to Lakota across the decades, he realized that his own children would grow up with an even more complete understanding of where they came from and what was possible in their lives. Sarah lived for 3 more years after returning from Washington, years filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had kept her promise to the man who had saved her life and shown her what love could be. She spent her final months writing letters to her great-grandchildren, leaving them a written record of their heritage and the lessons she had learned about courage, love, and the importance of standing up for truth even when it seemed dangerous or impossible. She died peacefully on a warm summer evening in 1927, sitting on her porch and wearing Dakota's necklace, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and red. David was holding her hand when she passed, and he later said that her final words were spoken in Lakota, a language she had learned from their father during those precious weeks in the cabin. She said, "Mitikui Oyasin," which means all my relations, a phrase that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all living things and the responsibility each person has to care for the whole community. Her funeral was attended by people from all walks of life and many different cultures, a gathering that would have been unthinkable in the world where she and Dakota first met. White settlers sat beside Native Americans, government officials mourned alongside former outlaws, and children of mixed heritage played together without fear or shame. It was a living demonstration of the world that Sarah and Dakota had dreamed of during those winter nights by the fire, a world where love was stronger than hatred and understanding was more powerful than prejudice. The cabin where Sarah and Dakota had found each other was never rebuilt, but the site became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking inspiration for their own impossible love stories. Years later, David arranged for a simple marker to be placed there, with an inscription in both English and Lakota. Here love transcended all boundaries. Here courage overcame fear. Here the future began. And in Silver Creek, in the house where Sarah had raised her son and lived to see her great-grandchildren play in the same garden where she had once grown herbs learned from Lakota tradition, her story continued to be told. Mothers spoke of it to daughters as an example of how strength could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Teachers shared it with students as proof that one person's courage could change the course of history. Lovers whispered it to each other as evidence that true love could survive anything the world tried to throw against it. The rejected orphan girl who had stumbled into a burning cabin carrying the child of a Lakota warrior had become something she never expected to be: a bridge between worlds, a keeper of secrets that needed to be told, and proof that love, when it is real and true and brave enough to face the flames, can create something beautiful even in the midst of the most impossible circumstances. Her legacy lived on not just in the children and grandchildren who carried her blood, but in the countless people who found hope in her story and the courage to believe that their own impossible dreams might also be worth fighting for. And sometimes, on quiet Colorado evenings when the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, people claimed they could still feel the presence of a love so powerful that not even death could diminish it, still watching over all who dared to believe that the human heart was stronger than any boundary the world might try to build around it.